I wanted to thank Doe for organizing this stuff and how much effort and energy he's put into putting together this society. Um, I guess I have a peculiar uh, position to take with respect to theoretical population biology in general, because in 1969, Sam Carlin, my thesis advisor, came to me and suggested that there wasn't enough scope in the current journals in biology to support growth in theoretical issues connected with population biology. And wouldn't it be good if there were a journal devoted to theoretical population biology? And of course, having just finished my PhD and wanting to submit some stuff, I wasn't going to argue with that position. And Sam happened to have some contacts at Academic Press, and the rest became history, except that Sam pushed me to become managing editor of the journal, which I did. And I must say that I thoroughly enjoyed it. But it's not the first time that theory was included into population biology. And I wanted to draw people's attention to this book, which was originally in French. And in this document, Baxer lists a kind of a history of where theory had been included in issues of population. And it extends from very ancient things to early life tables to Malthus, Bernoulli, and foundations of what we think of as epidemiology, Galton, Watson, and branching processes, the early papers on theoretical ecology, Fisher, and of course the 1918 paper, which he didn't mention here, but also the things that we know well about as evolutionary theorists. But this book is actually quite interesting in pointing out issues of the history of these subjects, that when we think of the 20th century as being the time that theory was really dominant in the modern evolutionary synthesis, there was a lot of other stuff that preceded it. The Stanford particular connection to theoretical population biology really began when Walter Bodmer, now Sir Walter, arrived at Stanford. A former student of R.A. Fisher arrived at the newly formed genetics department in the medical school and started to talk to Samuel Carlin and Jim McGregor. And when they did make this conversation, it became clear that to Sam Carlin, who was a brilliant mathematician, that there was scope within the field of genetics for the inclusion of some more formal mathematics and some new applied mathematics. One of the first excursions that Carlin made into genetics used a paper that the great Australian statistician and population scholar Pat Moran published, and I recommend his book, Moran's book of 1958, is a truly excellent discussion of theoretical population genetics. But Carlin and McGregor, they were interested in more in the mathematical side of what Moran had done. And you will see, if you go to Moran's book, you will see the origins of direct product branching processes, which became the first real new contribution that Carlin and McGregor made to population genetics. And it had a big effect on me because that was the subject of my master's thesis under the direction of the great Geoffrey Watterson in Melbourne. And Watterson's PhD thesis had been under Moran. He knew about these direct product branching processes. And when Carlin and McGregor went to apply some of these approximations to the stochastic processes that underlay the work of Fisher and Wright, they showed that there were different classes of diffusion models that could be developed under different assumptions on the relationship between the parameters and the population size. That was rather unpopular at the time because it was published in Wisconsin Press, and Sewell Wright was already there, and there was kind of an antithesis. There was kind of an antipathy towards more mathematical stuff than was being done at the time. And it took a while for that to register. And I think Theoretical Population Biology as a journal made a big, was responsible for the incorporation of theory into mainstream evolutionary theory. There weren't, as I said, there weren't enough outlets for the more mathematical papers. At that time, theoretical population biology was responsible for the expansion of the theory through multiple locus theory, assessment of adaptive topographies, what that meant, and quasi linkage equilibrium was being touted as a way to rescue adaptive topographies. And the ecological stuff that was initiated by MacArthur and Levins hadn't yet made it into the big time, and some people appreciate it. I mean, E.O. Wilson, for instance, and some ecologists, but it was still really fringe at that time. And there was an expansion into demography, for example. Questions started to be asked about how you extend demography to take care of the fact that there are two sexes in human populations. And of course, the great discoveries of the mid-1960s by Harry Harrison, Lewontin, and Hubby of the massive amounts of variation in population, they demanded an explanation that wasn't available up until that time in light of H.J. Muller's theory of the predominance of deleterious mutations among all of mutations. And there was a start for early computation. The computers were pretty small and not very capable at the time, but people started to use them. I'm going to give you a sample here of the early papers that eminent people that you may not remember. M.S. Bartlett, the great British statistician and theoretician, was one of the early publishers in TPB. Paul Samuelson, the famous economist, collaborated on human population dynamics in TPB. Leo Goodman and Nathan Kiefertz, very famous demographers, perhaps founders of how we look at demography today. Robert MacArthur, founder of modern theoretical ecology, published in TPB. Ken Cook, who was very eminent in the field of mathematical epidemiology, published in TPB. In those early days, the number of eminent people who were interested in having their theoretical work exposed via TPB was very important. In addition, from a personal point of view, these are the important things that have really been important to me anyway. Carlin had given me a problem in 1968. He didn't understand a paper that Masatoshi Nei had published in Genetics. He asked me to explain it. Well, I spent the next 5 years trying to understand it and came up with what became the foundations of modifier theory, which was published in Theoretical Population Biology, and it was a reduction showing that under a multi-locus model, genes that cause reduction in recombination rates would succeed. That, of course, was a very particular kind of selection model, and it was generalized in 1986 when I worked with Uri Lieberman to show it worked for any recombination and selection regime. But during that interim, I had given to my student Lee Altenberg the problem to find out why it was mathematically that there was a reduction principle. And in Lee Altenberg's thesis, he made quite a bit of progress towards that. However, it took until 2017 when we applied a very, very nice theorem of Carlin's in a paper that Carlin, a long paper that Carlin called Classifications of Selection and Migration Structures. That paper has a theorem on reduction of the eigenvalues of a certain class of matrices that von Donsker and Varidan had studied in variational theory. And we were able to use that to show that all of the models that I had worked on earlier on reduction of mutation, migration, and recombination fitted within one mathematical framework. And that theory was fitted within Carlin's theorem, which had nothing to do with genetics, actually. It was properties of certain class of matrices. So it was a long time between the asking of the first question and the solution to the whole problem. We also were fortunate that we developed the beginnings of cultural evolutionary theory. And in the first few papers, there was no outlets for this work in any other journals. It could not have been published in anthropology journals. And in the very first paper to do simultaneous evolution of genes and culture in 1976, which is the foundation of gene culture coevolutionary theory. That could not have been published in other journals. Later on in TPB, you see the evolution of the frequency-dependent cultural transmission, which included oblique and horizontal transmission, the notions of which Cavalli and I had introduced in the 70s, the difference between vertical, oblique, and horizontal transmission, and the notion of gene culture disequilibrium or culture disequilibrium. Those were all ideas that came out of theoretical population, the journal Theoretical Population Biology. And I'll draw your attention to the most recent paper, which is in press right now with my PhD student, Kayla Denton, which incorporates randomness into these cultural transmission models in a way that's never been done before, and in particular with respect to conformity. Now, I want to draw your attention to a little bit more history here. This is a very interesting section of the history of multi-locus theory, and I find this a very fascinating subject. In 1963, the great P.A.P. Moran published this paper in which he wanted to know how many equilibria there were in a two-locus model and how many could be stable. And he published it in the Australian Journal of Biological Sciences, which is not the one that comes to mind first, but he probably, had TPB been around at the time, would have sent it to TPB. In that paper, he claimed that there are at most 5 equilibria, and at most 3 of them could be stationary states. Now, very interestingly, the reason that he did that in the way that he did it was because Sewell Wright thought that evolutionary change could be described by saying that populations move so as to maximize the mean fitness. That is a notion of the adaptive topography. And Moran withdrew that 1963 paper. And he said, using this incorrect theory, I attempted to discuss this problem and how many of these states could be, equilibria could be stable. And he boldly states the theory is incorrect and the number of possible stationary and stable points is an open question. However, it is possible that 5 and 3 are the correct bounds, and this is suggested by the following argument. And he went into a following argument. Now, that argument had historic interest to Carlin and I, because when we came up with our two-locus model that was published in the very first issues of Theoretical Population Biology, we went to Sewell Wright in Wisconsin, and we showed him that there could be 7 equilibria and how many of them could be stable. He was really resistant to the notion. He said, the equilibria have to be the stationary points of the adaptive topography. It took a long time and a lot of stuff on the blackboard to convince him that that wasn't the case. Now, how many equilibria and how many could be stable was not in general understood. The class of models that Carlin and I worked on was symmetric viability model. And when Carlin wrote his review in 1975 of two-locus theory, which was in Theoretical Population Biology, he made the claim that for 2 loci and 2 alleles, the exact bound of all the numbers of equilibria containing interior boundary was 4. A 2-locus, and he also made the statement in that same review that a 2-locus, 2-allele system influenced by differential viability pressures cannot simultaneously have equilibria with the disequilibrium 0 and the disequilibrium non-zero. So those were 2 statements that Carlin made in that famous review, both of which were wrong. And the correction to those was also published in Theoretical Population Biology, and working with Ian Franklin, who was in Sydney at the time, we showed that you could have simultaneous equilibria that were stable, one having a d equals 0 disequilibrium, one having d not equals 0. And that really staggered Carlin. So he came to me and he said, that must be true of the multiplicative viability system, a general multiplicative viability system. So we sat down and developed some analysis that showed exactly right. So Carlin was actually very magnanimous about not getting upset that we had shown these things to be wrong, that he had published previously. In addition, the numbers of symmetric equilibria, we showed that you could have 5 and 6 stable, not just the 4 that he claimed from his review paper, and that we showed analytically that you could have 4 fixation states in either 1 or 2 polymorphic equilibria stable at the same time. So these debates or corrections that evolved, and TPB was very important in A, raising the questions, and B, seeing the debate evolve and the solutions come out. Now, I had the privilege to review Will Provine's book on Sewell Wright for the New York Times. And in it, there's a section which is very critical of adaptive topographies as a notion. And it happened that Sewell Wright was visiting Stanford, visiting a professor in the medical school who had lived in Wisconsin and was a family friend of Sewell Wright. And they invited me to come over and have a chat. And I went over and I asked Sewell Wright what he thought about that criticism of adaptive topographies. And Sewell was very infirm at the time and nearly blind. He used a very big screen, and he had Crow do a lot of the writing for him. But he told me, he said, and he wrote this in his, when he explained this, how he came about it, I said, I happened to be an editor of the American Naturalist at the time, and I said, would you please write that down, what you told me now, would you write it down and we'll publish it in the American Naturalist? And he went back, he did write it down, and this was his last paper, which was in some ways an apology for the notion of adaptive topographies. And if you read it, it's not exactly an apology, but it's close. And he said the reason that he developed that was because East had asked him to present this non-mathematical account of evolution. And so he'd put pictures, he told me, he put pictures on the blackboard and explained everything through pictures. And then he gives a very interesting paragraph, and I reckon everybody should read this, about comparing the theories of Kimura, Fisher, and Haldane and Wright. And that really, which the article came out in the American Naturalist. And he is very interesting in how he views the contributions of the giants in the field besides himself. And he ended up saying that all the points of view that the people had were valid. He was actually a very easy guy to communicate with and had placed no exterior value judgments on the mathematical theory. Now, since those days, I would point to the expansion of the marvelous Ewens-Watterson theory of neutral, that should be not neural, but neutral mutations, and in particular, the rise of Kingman's coalescent as a framework for understanding evolution, and then later of neutral, but then later on selection with recombination, and how it's been used in phylogenetic analysis by Noah in particular, but other people as well. There's been wonderful extensions of the ecological theory of MacArthur and Levins, the evolutionary ecology of sex and recombination and mutation together, and that includes the important work of Sally Otto. Random life histories and other aspects of demography, including Tolja work, and of course, the huge expansion of game theory into evolutionary ecology, bringing over stuff from economics. Then the complex epidemiological models that have been developed to include behavior and multi-state descriptions of the epidemic. Cultural evolution has now become absolutely mainstream with the Society of Cultural Evolution, the Cultural Evolution Society, which now has more than 300 members and has biannual meetings. All of that came out of these original works. We have to say that TPB had a lot to the subsequent development. Now, incorporation of developmental biology into evolutionary models is relatively recent, and it includes a lot of theory of non-genetic inheritance, epigenetics, and issues connected with how the environment changes rates of evolution. And of course, one can't forget the massive expansion of computation into the whole field, without which there wouldn't be as many papers at all. And I'd say TPB still continues to be a leader in incorporation of all of these bulleted points here into the field of population biology as a whole. Thank you very much.